Another aspect of ecosystem ecology are biogeochemical cycles. These are how chemicals move through ecosystems. They can move through ecosystems through biological mechanisms where they're absorbed and released by living things, geological mechanisms that involve weathering and erosion of rocks, and chemical mechanisms where they're dissolved in rain and snow, they exist as gases, and other chemical processes. So we'll take a look at the water cycle first. The water cycle is a little bit different from the others because the water is not actually chemically changed, it just changes forms, like going from a gas to a liquid, and from a liquid back to a gas. And that process is fueled by the sun's energy. So those are called evaporation and precipitation. So evaporation is when we have liquid or the solid, so ice can go straight back to gas. That actually happens in Colorado a fair bit. You've maybe seen on a sunny day the way that steam will rise from snow. And then you can also have gas going back to a liquid and or solid in the case of snow, and that is precipitation. And so when we think of it, sort of that process of evaporation and precipitation, we often sort of picture evaporation coming from big bodies of water, but actually most of the water that evaporates into the atmosphere actually comes from plants. So they're, on a hot day, they're actually giving off a bunch of moisture from their leaves. And that's a lot of where the evaporation is coming from. And that's called evapotranspiration, when it's coming out of plant matter. And so in this image here, we can see evapotranspiration from land, which is coming from the leaves of plants. We can see evaporation from the sea, that's sending water vapor into the sky. Now, water vapor doesn't necessarily condense and fall back where it rose from. So for example, the evaporation can have happened over the ocean, and those clouds can move into Colorado. And so when we say a storm is coming from the Pacific, the moisture that's falling in Colorado is coming from the Pacific. It's not coming from Colorado. And so as it exists in the clouds, it can condense and form back into snow or rain that falls back over land. And then it can percolate into the soil. It can enter into groundwater. So that would be like coming from wells or in the soil itself. It can be in creeks and rivers and make its way to the ocean. So at any given time, most of the water is not in living things or in the soil. It's somewhere in either the ocean, in the soil, or up in the atmosphere. So there's a lot more water that's out there than is being captured by living things, in other words. So how do humans alter the water cycle? It's always important to understand how we kind of mess up the cycles, and I'll emphasize this as we go through these different cycles. Humans have a couple of major impacts. First of all, humans change where water is going through the process of things like reservoirs, irrigation systems. So the Denver metro area is a really prime example of this. We actually dramatically change the movement of water. So a lot of the water that is consumed in the Denver Aurora metro area actually comes from the western slope. Left to its own devices, that water would flow towards the Pacific. But because we have taken that water and pumped it over the mountains, we've brought it to the other side. And so water is actually discharged here, and water discharged here, like after it goes through like a wastewater treatment facility, or if it runs off of somebody's grass, it actually ends up flowing to the Gulf instead. So because of how we've changed the movement of water to serve human needs, we've made that water not flow to where it used to go. And so that's a pretty dramatic effect on the water system. And so that changes where that water ends up, which can then potentially change where precipitation goes. Now, the volume, a lot of people would argue, is not so much, even though it is a lot. Obviously, we use a lot of water in Denver, Aurora metro area. Compared to the amount of water that's in the oceans, it's not a huge amount. we perhaps have a larger influence on groundwater reserves. So groundwater is water that's deep in the soil, and depending on the groundwater source, it's either, kind of close to the ground or it's very, very deep. And we're also dramatically changing groundwater levels. So again, to take Colorado as a case point, most of the groundwater in Colorado is very deep. It's in ancient aquifers that are what are called non-renewable aquifers. That means that once upon a time, that water got trapped deep under the ground. We're talking hundreds of feet deep, and it no longer fills. So when rain falls, it doesn't percolate down to the aquifers that are in Colorado. And so as we move water out of those aquifers, we're emptying them. So non-renewable aquifers are actually emptying at a measurable rate in Colorado and Nebraska and Kansas as well. And so it is a reasonable estimate that they could be below pumpable levels within a couple hundred years. And that's a big concern because a lot of people and crop growing currently depends on those non-renewable aquifers. And then the other big impact we have on the water cycle is through climate change. So this process where the water evaporates from the ocean and wind currents move those clouds and drop that precipitation, that's all being impacted by climate change. So as global temperatures increase, it's affecting this evaporation rate and where it evaporates and how those clouds move. And so that's where some of the variability in the predictions come from for whether places like Colorado will get more or less precipitation, for example, as we face climate change, is we know that it's going to change the way that water is moving from place to place. And that's a big unknown for crop growing and human uses and needs. So I'll take a look now at the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient. All living organisms require phosphorus. It's in our DNA, it's in proteins. It's an essential building block. Unlike some of the other cycles, there's no gaseous phase. So the only reservoir of phosphorus on Earth is in rock. So it's in the crust of the Earth, in rock. And so it gets into soil when rock erodes. And as the rock erodes, it enters the soil. And then from the soil, it can go into plants and into animals that eat the plants. And then once it's in plants and animals, it can re-enter the soil through decomposition. So we have, again, kind of a reservoir in rock. As the rock erodes, it enters the soil, it enters living things through the soil, and then cycles back into the soil through decomposition. It can also run off of soil and eroding rock and enter waterways like oceans and lakes. And if that happens, there's a millions and billions of years process in which that would potentially over time sediment back into rock. But again, that's like a millions of years process. So we can't exactly rely on reclaiming phosphorus from water. And when it's in water, it can also be captured by aquatic plants and animals. So let me not forget to mention that. So that's how it gets to plants and animals. And so we were talking about how in aquatic ecosystems, phosphorus is very limiting, and that is how it gets to them, and there's not a lot that gets to them, so it's limiting to their growth. So how do humans impact this cycle? So humans are extracting phosphorus at a much higher rate than natural erosion processes through mining. So we access the rock phosphorus and then we apply it to fields as fertilizer. And so the mining is generating a lot of excess phosphorus. Oops, you can't really read that. Let me write that differently. So I'm just going to highlight here some of the impact areas. So humans are doing mining at this part. That causes an excess in the fields or in the ecosystems, and then that excess runs off, and so we then get excess in the water. And that excess in the water can lead to overgrowth. And we'll talk about and take a closer look at the consequences of that overgrowth in a second. The other big issue besides this overgrowth, so that excess leads to this overgrowth, but the other big problem is that this is a non-renewable source. So just like anything else that is mined, there's a limit to what we can extract. And so at some point, we're going to run out of rock phosphorus. And I say, at some point, but some people think that it's as close as within the next 50 years. So this is not like oil where we're talking, okay, someday in the future we're going to run out of this. We don't exactly know when. No, some people think as recent as close as 50 years we'll have mined out all of the rock phosphorus that we can access. And the consequences of that is major for our food system. So remember, we said that phosphorus increases plant productivity, which in farming terms is food yield. So without the addition of rock phosphorus, we're going to see declining food yield, which is going to be a challenge, as we've talked about, because we're going to have a lot more people in the next 50 years. So this is another sort of a squeeze point for humans over the next century, and how we're going to address this issue is unclear at this point. So to take a closer look at that excess, so excess phosphorus generated by adding fertilizer. I'm reminding you again that phosphorus is a limiting element in most aquatic systems. So if you add phosphorus, you increase aquatic productivity. And at first glance, that sounds like a positive thing, but in fact, it is a negative thing because it leads to something called eutrophication. Elevated nutrient levels cause this algal bloom. Okay, well, that doesn't seem that bad, but the problem is that the algae grow so quickly and then they decompose. And this is kind of the weird part. So you get this huge boost in algae, and then that boosts the decomposition by decomposers. So this might be things like bacteria. And as they're decomposing, they consume oxygen. So you get this increased algal growth. The algae die, and then decomposers consume that dying algae. And as they do that, they consume oxygen. And what this causes is a loss of oxygen in the water. So this is occurring in water where oxygen is not as plentiful as it is in air. Because remember, oxygen has to dissolve into the water, and that's a slow process. And so as they decompose, they strip all the oxygen out of the water. And so this becomes a place where nothing that requires oxygen can live. So all of the other organisms like fish that need oxygen in that area die or have to move out of it. And this creates what's called a dead zone. There's no oxygen, therefore there's no living things that can survive there anymore. And so this is an image of the dead zone along the Gulf of Mexico. So the red area is the dead zone. And so this dead zone is caused by excess nutrients, again, this eutrophication. And what is happening here, this is Louisiana, if you're not familiar. Oh, you can't really see that. Let me try a different color. What we have here is the Mississippi Basin. So Louisiana is the place where the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River extends all the way from up in like Minnesota and then kind of goes through several of the Midwestern states and drains most of the Midwest and West. So remember, it drains half of Colorado and then the other side, Kansas, Missouri, all these other states. And so a lot of that area is major farmland with a lot of fertilizer being added. And so it really ends up draining fertilizer from more than half the country. And so all of that excess nutrient is coming from fertilizer-laden fields, from manure, from feedlots as well. Don't want to leave them out in blame. And so all of the nutrients come out and drain into this area of the Gulf and cause this dead zone. And again, this didn't exist without human interference. This isn't a natural dead zone. This is really caused by farming practices in the United States. Okay, so let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is similar to phosphorus in that it's a limiting nutrient. It's also an essential component of proteins, nucleic acids, and also chlorophyll. There's an abundance of atmospheric nitrogen in the form of N2. This is a gaseous form. So 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas. However, this is not usable by most living things. So you and I are always breathing in nitrogen gas, and we're breathing it right back out. We can't absorb it at all. So again, the majority of living things can't absorb nitrogen in this form. And so instead, we rely on a whole complex process that makes it available to us. This starts with nitrogen fixation. A small number of bacteria are able to take nitrogen gas and convert it into ammonia or ammonium. And this is what makes nitrogen available to all other living things. The ammonia that's now present, created by nitrogen fixation, can be converted into nitrate by additional soil bacteria. And then the nitrate is what can be used by plants. So again, in order to get into our ecosystems, it has to go through these bacterial processes, and that makes it available to plants. Plants then make it available to animals, and they can incorporate ammonia and nitrate into their bodies. And then decomposition then feeds this back into the soil. So you have a little bit of a loop there. So we'll take a look at the image here. So again, we have an abundance of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. Soil bacteria can incorporate that into ammonia or ammonium, and then that can be converted into nitrates by other bacteria. And then it's these forms that can be assimilated. So this term here, assimilated into plants, and then plants can pass it to animals. And then when plants and animals decompose, broken down by things like bacteria and fungi, it returns ammonia to the soil and nitrates to the soil, and that can be reabsorbed. So this is kind of the circular part here. Okay. There are some bacteria that can also re-release nitrogen gas to the atmosphere. Most of the time, nitrogen is going through this circular process here that I've highlighted in yellow, so it's relying on recycling quite a bit. So most of the nitrogen in our bodies actually passes through other living things through the process of decomposition. Like with phosphorus, we also have issues with fertilizer runoff leading to eutrophication. Fossil fuels also release nitrogen into the atmosphere, which can come back as acid rain. So just to take a closer look at those human impacts, humans have doubled the rate of nitrogen input into the cycle. So we are having a huge impact on nitrogen. The reason why we can add so much nitrogen is that we are extracting it from fossil fuels. So in that sense, it's also a non-renewable source like phosphorus. We're really getting it as a byproduct of fossil fuel products. I've got this picture here because this is a fertilizer container. And so any fertilizer container typically has what's called the NPK value. So it's showing the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium. So 2 to 1 to 6 is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so nitrogen fertilizer runoff, just like phosphorus, can cause eutrophication. So when we see the dead zone in Louisiana, that is a combination of both nitrogen and phosphorus being added to the water there. Excess nitrates are also accumulating in drinking water sources, so it can percolate down into groundwater, and so shallow wells are particularly susceptible to this. It can also end up in bodies of water, though those are usually treated, so not as much of a hazard as groundwater. And as I mentioned, when we burn fossil fuels, because they contain nitrogen, they also add nitrogen to the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen oxides, which can cause acid rain. So some major impacts here from the addition of nitrogen. Okay, last cycle we'll look at is really just a refresher of the carbon cycle. So a reminder that photosynthesis fixes carbon from the atmosphere, so it pulls out CO2 and puts it into plants. From plants, that carbon goes into animals. And then decomposition and cellular respiration both re-release CO2 to the atmosphere. So this is the circular part of it. And so we also have carbon sinks. So let me add that here in a different color. So if decomposition fails to happen, oops, there we go. If decomposition fails to happen, we can get carbon trapped in carbon sinks. So this is things like fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are really carbon trapped by the failure to decompose at some point in the history of the Earth, so millions of years ago. And so same thing happens with peat moss. Like peat is mosses that didn't decompose, and so it's trapped carbon in them. And so that pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that's how, for example, you could have had more CO2 in the atmosphere 400 million years ago than you had 200 million years later. It's because 400 million years ago, we had a bunch of carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere due to the failure of animals and plants to decompose. And so humans are now burning those fossil fuels very quickly and releasing that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So again, this is through the burning of fossil fuels that this is occurring. So basically, we're taking something that was a carbon sink and we're burning that up and re-releasing it. Forests are also carbon sinks. So trees live for a really long time, and then they take a long time to decompose. And so something like a rainforest is a carbon sink as well. And so when we burn down a rainforest, we're also releasing all the carbon that was being held in those trees. So that contributes to this problem as well. And this diagram is showing the CO2 levels over the last 50 years. This is as far back as our accurate data goes, or since we've been actually monitoring it. We can collect data about CO2 in different ways, but since we've been actively monitoring it and getting real-time reads. This is at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And so again, we've been monitoring there since the 1960s, and we can see this dramatic increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is very fast. I mean, for Earth scale. Remember, Earth scale stuff usually happens over eons, millions of years. But we've seen a significant rise in just a half a century. And this is tracking temperatures. So CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and so we're seeing impacts on global average temperatures because of this increase in the greenhouse gas CO2 as well as other greenhouse gases. A reminder that we see this cyclical up and down in CO2 levels because of the action of plants across the seasons. So you get a drop in CO2 when plants pick up photosynthesis in the spring and throughout the summer. And then you see a rise in CO2 as plants do less photosynthesis in the fall and the winter. And so that's where these bumps come from. But again, overall, a dramatic increase due to the burning of fossil fuels.